Hi everyone, my name is Ananya and I am the president or the coordinator of the Multicultural Week. Welcome to today's episode of Dialogue with the Departments. That's what we've decided to call this series. And it's a series of interviews with different faculty members and at the University of St. Andrews to discuss diversity, to discuss multiculturalism, and generally barriers faced within academia. Today, we're really happy to have Dr. Raychaudhuri with us, and he's from the English department, and he'll be joining us on today's interview.
Hi, thanks for asking me.
Okay, wonderful. If you could just introduce yourself, tell us a little about
Sure.
yourself.
So my name is Anindya Raychaudhuri. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of English. I work on a variety of different things. I do work on South Asian studies. I've done a little bit of work on partition. I work on the South Asian diaspora globally. I guess my principal interests are in what we might call critical theory, specifically to do with race, class, Marxism, and so on and so forth. Within the School of English, my part of my administrative role involves sitting on the EDI, the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So I have a diversity interest both in terms of administrative aspects of the university and in terms of my own research.
Okay, wonderful. So I think obviously considering the current climate and also general conversations of looking into diversity within the faculty, I think you'll also be very well equipped to answer some of the questions we have.
I'll do my best.
Just starting it off with, the current conversations about diversity within curriculum, members of faculty, academia around the world, because there seems to be suddenly a lot of interest in this. But the idea is that none of these conversations are actually new. So what are your thoughts on the current climate and what's been happening?
Um, there there are moments that can be seen as a tipping point, right? As you say, the conversations are not new. The demands in terms of whether we want to think about calling it diversifying a curriculum or decolonizing a curriculum, however we want to conceptualize it, however we want to frame it, these demands aren't new. The concerns about having a non-representative curriculum in whatever subject you're talking about, these issues aren't new, but every now and then there are moments, it seems, in history when the demand can't as easily be silenced as it can in other moments, and that's what I mean by a tipping point. And it seems we are at a tipping point now. Now, being at a tipping point doesn't guarantee change, right? It involves a lot of hard work on the part of those of us who want change to make best use of the tipping point, so that we hold our institutions to account. They don't get away with cosmetic changes that don't actually affect meaningful improvements, as it were. Um, but it's an opportunity. It's definitely an opportunity where the powers that be, management, are being forced to listen, and then it's up to us to keep up the pressure so that the listening can then be translated into genuine change.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with that. Myself, I'm the BAME Association officer for the university this year. And obviously, there has been a lot of traction, and we've used this opportunity to establish the BAME Students Network as a subcommittee of the union. So there's been a lot of support for that. So
Yeah,
that's
and
definitely
I mean there have been multiple really good organizations within St Andrews student body that have been doing really good work. You mentioned the BAME Student Network. We are St Andrews on Facebook has been doing fantastic work over the last few years now. And this is one area where staff and student not just need to work more closely together. We sort of it's a really good opportunity because our university general in particular, and universities in general, are sort of structurally more inclined to listen to students than to staff, right? So staff can ask for particular measures, demands, procedures put in place, and the speed of change seems much slower. If there is a concerted effort from students, as there is, I think, at the moment, then that is a demand that is much less easy to ignore.
Yeah, definitely. On talking a little about the
Yeah.
university, and obviously we are in a fairly traditional university, do you think in general there has been a lot of inherent resistance to change, or do you think St. Andrews has been fairly receptive of change, considering its history and considering the context?
Um, Now that's a difficult question to answer. I think there has been a lot of structural inertia, some of which isn't necessarily to do with active refusal to engage with diversity. Now, some of it is to do with active refusal to engage with diversity, and we can come to that in a second. But there are really odd barriers. Like if I take the project of decolonizing the curriculum to start with, it seems to me, and this is just my personal position, people might disagree with it, but it seems to me that to have a decolonized curriculum, it must also be an interdisciplinary curriculum. In other words, if we take English on its own, or history on its own, or psychology on its own, or even biology and chemistry on its own, it is much harder, next to impossible, to have a decolonized syllabus if we exist in the silos of disciplines. Now, the way the university is set up, it encourages interdisciplinary research. I think we are really good at doing interdisciplinary research. Many of us our work spreads across multiple disciplines. But I think we are really bad at doing interdisciplinary teaching. And that is to do with very specific, nitty gritty, boring admin strictures to do with workload, to do with module codes, which module belongs in which school. None of that is at least explicitly about diversity. None of these measures were designed to inhibit diversity, but that's the effect they're having. So that's one aspect of the resistance to change, as it were. And then there is a more structural, specific resistance to diversity, uh, to do with concerns about merit. We can talk separately about merit if you like. I have lots of thoughts about the concept of merit. Um, we have some geographical limitations in terms of where we are in the world and what kind of people we can persuade to come and work and study in St. Andrews. And all of those things are sort of, each individual factor gets multiplied, right? So that the overall effect in terms of resistance to change is more than the sum of the parts of these individual effects.
Yeah, definitely. I think specifically as an international student coming to St. Andrews, in general, obviously I understand. So I'm also an English major and I'm studying English. And in my first 2 years, I did complet as a module. And there was an attempt to include different disciplines or different countries and literature from different countries. But it was quite different from where I was coming from. Like a lot of the literature I read specifically in high school, because I think in my younger years, it was still ingrained within me to read certain kind of books or certain
Yeah.
classics. And there was this, even in India, there was this emphasis on reading literature from England. So
Mm.
not just English literature. But obviously, as I grew older, when I started developing my own interests, the kind of literature I read was quite different. So even growing up in that context and coming to the UK, despite trying to make the curriculum diverse or include literature from different parts of the world, I personally did feel that difference or that limitation.
Yeah.
But I know like there is a lot of conversation on decolonizing curriculums, and one recommendation which everyone talks a lot about is diversifying reading lists. Now, obviously, that's what people talk about in the mainstream, but I think there's more to decolonizing curriculums than that. So I
Of
want
course.
to know your thoughts on that as a concept.
Um, So in terms of diversifying the reading list, the phrase that occurs to me is necessary but not sufficient. It is a good, important first step, but on its own, it's not enough.
Mhm.
I guess the way I think about it is, what are the systemic changes that would need to happen in order to allow for diversifying a reading list? And a lot of those changes that would need to happen. So, for example, if we have, I'll use English as an example. Let's say, and we don't have to speak about any particular department. Let's say it's, in abstract, an English department realizes that it looks across all of its modules that it offers, and it realizes that it has no literature at all from the continent of Africa, right? It realizes that this is a problem. Now, in order to solve the problem, what it has to then do as a first step is to recruit a member of staff who is qualified to teach the literature from the continent of Africa. Um, Now, once you start identifying major gaps, and then you realize that in order to solve those gaps, you are going to have to put resources in, the solution will inevitably be about more than diversifying the reading list, because you are going to then get uh, a diverse body of staff, because you will need a diverse body of staff who are qualified to teach that knowledge. Once you have a diverse curriculum, you will attract diverse students. You will increase the number of people on campus who are people of color. Our community will become larger. Therefore, our voices will be louder. It will be harder to ignore our other demands for equality and inclusion and so on. So it's sort of like domino blocks, right? Like the initial point of recognition that this is a problem that we need to solve will hopefully lead to solutions to other problems beyond the okay, we need a book from Africa to tick another box. Um, and it's that, the continuum of change, that interests me there.
Yes, definitely. I think that fits perfectly with my next question and has kind of answered most of it, which was, what do you think the university, as like the administration, can do to go beyond this ticking the boxes approach? Because the thing right now is that people want change and people want it really fast. And because of that, there is this tendency of putting measures into place that seem like they're making a change, but they're also quite surface level. So more about actually going in and restructuring knowledge systems and creating an environment that's inclusive rather than just, for the optics of it, or rather than just based on how it looks. So what do you think that the university can actually do?
The biggest, most important thing is we need more of us. Unless we get to a stage where there are enough people, both among staff and students, who are bringing the experience of being a person, the lived experience of being a person of color to the campus, we are always going to be too small a group to get our voice heard. It's easier to ignore us. So going back to the point we were making earlier about, this is a tipping point. The university's management is feels like they have to demonstrate they're listening to us. If that is the case, which I think it is, then what we need to do most, above everything else, is to say to the university, put your money where your mouth is. Words, uh, 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 training courses, different diversified reading lists, all of those things are important. But until and unless we have more actual material resources being devoted to this issue, it is not going to get better. It's not going to be enough. Until we get to a point where most of us who are people of color in this university don't don't look around the university, look around the department, and see ourselves as the only person of color. Until that changes, all the other changes will be much, much harder. So, as a matter of urgency, we need to recruit a more diverse staff. We need to incentivize the recruitment of diverse students. We can do that through specific scholarships. One really key thing is PhD scholarships for projects that are about diversity, right? Because that then creates the body of knowledge, that then creates the next generation of faculty, um, which is essential to be able um, to sustain the change, right? Because um, even if we assume the university, and this is at the moment a huge assumption that isn't necessarily based in reality, but let's assume the university tomorrow gave us, you know, hundreds of thousands of pounds to recruit a faculty member of color for one per department. That would be a huge change. The university is nowhere near close to doing that, but it wouldn't be enough because it wouldn't be sustainable. So trying to find a way of directing the resources so that we are creating the next generation of academic who is intellectually and politically committed to increasing diversity. And that takes time and that takes money. If the university is really so confident that it is genuinely interested in increasing diversity, then put resources, give money. That's what it takes.
Yes, definitely. I think because of the BAME Students Network, we do want to have an active dialogue with the university because, yes, critique is at its place. We need to call them out. But also, I think if we don't work collaboratively with them, the change won't be sustainable because the change is not about a single person. It's not about me or it's not about the person who comes after me. But to create a system, we'll have to work collaboratively with them. And we're hoping that they do feel the same way and that we are able to take this conversation forward.
Yeah, and as I said before, the student voice is absolutely paramount here to look at every level of the university, professional staff, support staff, undergraduate students, postgraduate students, academic staff at every rank, school management, senior management in College Gate, all of these levels, we need a much bigger presence of a body of people who can talk about what it's like to be a person of color in St. Andrews. Because it doesn't matter how well intentioned a lot of the measures that are being put into place to make St. Andrews more diverse and equal. And a lot of those measures are very well intentioned. You know, there are people working hard at it. But unless they know what it's like, viscerally, physically, what it's like to look around a room and see yourself as the only person of color, unless if you are filling in a staff survey or a student survey questionnaire that is supposed to be anonymous, and you know it can't be anonymous because as soon as you tick the ethnicity box, it's clear that it's you. Unless that changes, it's going to be really hard because any demand for change will have to involve one person being brave enough to stick their head above the parapet, and that's a lonely thing to do. Um, so that's the key thing, the increasing our numbers so that we get to a critical mass, at which point we can no longer be ignored.
Definitely. You spoke a bit about like the personal experience of being a person of color, and um, in your experience in academia or even like as a teacher, has your experience ever personally been impacted by race, or have you had any particular experiences which have been shocking or something you'd like to share?
Um, as it happens, not in St. Andrews, oddly, or not to the same extent. It's the kind of micro. I mean, we use the term microaggressions, right? Where each individual event on its own doesn't seem to be that big or that consequential, but when it gets piled on one after another on a constant low level hum of feeling like you don't belong. The classic one, which anyone who's been a person of color in Britain at any point will recognize, which is the "Where are you from?" question, because someone who looks like you can't be from here. So where are you really from? And you might be second generation, third generation, fourth generation British, but you will constantly get asked the "Where are you from?" question. One really interesting way it has affected me professionally as an academic is the assumption that I must be doing post-colonial studies as a researcher. Now, at the moment, I am doing some post-colonial studies, but if you go back, my PhD wasn't in post-colonial studies, for example. I do a lot of things that isn't post-colonial studies. But there is a kind of association that is often made, where people look at the way you look and make assumptions about the kind of research you are expected to be doing. And at that point, you have a really interesting dilemma, because you, as an academic of color, can either make a point and say, actually, no, just because I'm an academic of color doesn't mean I can't study Shakespeare, for example, or I can't study, T.S. Eliot or British modernism or whatever. But if you do that, the knowledge production, the syllabus, the reading list stays as white as ever. Or you can say, okay, I'm going to, take one for the team, as it were, and live up to your stereotype of me and do post-colonial studies. But that way, the curriculum of the department I'm working in will begin to look a bit different. So that's been the dilemma in terms of me being racialized. The other experiences have more been sort of in the public, on the ground, where having to hear comments or having to hear insults, which insults which might have been made in general anyway, but because I look the way I look, they have been racially inflected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the first dilemma which you pointed out was quite interesting, because it's something I haven't thought about a lot personally. Obviously, I'm just starting out. I don't know exactly what I want to do, but I am drawn towards looking into post-colonialism and the diaspora and generally like South Asian history. But it's something that I haven't considered before, because I am quite drawn to that area of study. So that was quite interesting.
And sorry, not to interrupt, but here again, the numbers matter, right? If there is only one South Asian person or one Black person in a faculty, then what their specialism is becomes really important. If there are five of us, then together we can afford to look at a range of different things and teach a range of different things without feeling that the work that goes into diversity is being borne by only one of us, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. I think the other thing I was interested to know, and we have briefly touched upon this, is what can students do? Because like you said, that students do have, we're a larger number. The university does tend to listen to students, specifically when the pressure is from the student body. So because right now there is kind of a wave, and as you said, it's like a tipping point where a lot of people are interested in these conversations, young people. And what I see is that there's a lot of social media activism, but I personally worry that it doesn't translate into as much action being taken. And this might be an unpopular opinion right now, but I think social media is full of infographics and things people are reposting, and that's all very well and good. But I worry that specifically for younger people, that solely is not action. So what do you think we can do more of to actually change that?
Learn how the university works, and learn what the pressure points are, right? For our university, one of the very important pressure points is the module evaluation questionnaire and the National Student Survey. because the university pays a lot of attention to the results of those. So use those pressure points wherever you can. One of the things I hope I teach my students, or I like to think I teach my students, is the importance of anger. I think there are many things in the world that one should be angry about. Anger doesn't have to be destructive. Anger can be constructive. And I would like, I mean, humanity in general, but our students as well, to be angrier about certain things. You know, if you are interested in studying literature from around the world, or if you're interested in studying um, Nigerian philosophy, and your university department, which claims to be diverse and world leading and reflective of the entire knowledge of humanity, and yet there is no opportunity for you to study these things that you are interested in, then get angry about it, make a fuss, complain, do make collective anger from the body of students to stand up and say this is not acceptable. Is for me the only thing that ever changes, ever makes a difference, is collective anger. And that anger might take the form of petitioning university management, collective letter writing. It might take the form of rallies, protests, occupying spaces, all of these forms of protest, physical protest and social media protest. I think you're right. Neither of those two things can exist without the other. For it to be effective, it has to involve all of these pressure points. Anger. Get more angry at the world.
I think that's a wonderful message, and I think it'll be very well received with our audiences. While you were talking about this, another thought came into my mind. It's something I considered a lot in my first year, and you touched upon it briefly when you talked about how the curriculum is created in a certain way just for like administrative purposes, to understand modules and a limited number of time also we have. I think one thing that definitely struck me was I was in my first year, and I was looking at honors modules and things I would be interested in, and there was things in South Asian history, there were different things in let's say African modernisms, because I'm also doing art history. But also it occurred to me that everything I'm studying in my first 2 years, which is mandatory, is still mainstream. So all of these approaches are still alternative, or
Sure.
But the mainstream knowledge is still Eurocentric. So it's something I definitely wanted your thoughts on, because there is that problem of trying to understand what is mainstream, like what you necessarily need to study, because it might be different for everyone. But I think it's a very interesting thing to think about, because on one end you want to maybe I want to study more about South Asian history as mainstream because that's what I've grown up studying, but maybe for someone else that's not the same. So how do you essentially decide?
I think there are two different answers to that question. The first question is an administrative answer specifically to St Andrews, but it's not. It's there are corollaries in other universities, which is it is always harder and therefore more important to diversify the core curriculum, the compulsory modules, which in St Andrews is typically the sub-honors modules.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason it is harder to do that is, generally speaking, this is certainly true for English, and I think it's true for most other departments that I know about, the sub-honors modules are team taught, right? So in order to effectively change a syllabus, you have to be able to work with the entire faculty, which makes it, with all the goodwill in the world, it makes it harder because it's a more complex beast, as it were. Everyone's workloads need to be factored in. What lectures people have ready to give need to be factored in. Who's going to do the tutorials to go with the lectures, that needs to be factored in. If I want to do a module on literature from the South Asian subcontinent, as at honors level, I just put a module together. I'm teaching that entire module myself. I don't need anyone else's input. I don't need anyone else's work to be able to do that. So that is the sort of structural, institutional answer to that question. In terms of sort of intellectual pedagogical answer to the question, I think, again, not to repeat myself, but it comes back to critical mass. When there is enough of us working, it will no longer be alternative. Uh, Something appearing as the alternative to the mainstream on a syllabus is better than it not appearing at all. But as long as it appears as an alternative to the Eurocentric mainstream, we haven't yet decolonized, as it were. And that is, and perhaps the answer to that question is decolonizing is a process. It will always be a process. It will, at least in the near future, not be a finished project. It's a process that will carry on. We'll have improvements. Sometimes we'll have setbacks. But if we are to be serious about decolonizing the curriculum, then the final goal has to be, we should get to the place where we can study the knowledge produced from all parts of the world on their own terms, right? So we don't have to think about Indian modernisms only in comparison to Anglo-American modernism, or we don't have to think of South African philosophy only in comparison to French philosophy. Or perhaps even we might think of French philosophy in comparison to South African philosophy, right? So it's not just about leveling the playing field, it's about reversing the center alternative dynamic, where why can't we recenter the global south and think about how the global north is influenced by the global south, not the other way around.
Definitely. I completely agree with that. But I also think that a lot of that education starts at an even earlier level. So while reforming university education is quite important, it can't be the case where you just come into university and these different ideas are put into your head. Because if this is conditioned from like childhood, from when you're at school, I think it might be easier to actually restructure your thought in that way, because that's what you've grown up believing. Because I know these conversations were had a lot when I was in St. Andrews, because I had friends from everywhere. And for me, it was so shocking that most people in Britain had not studied about the empire, when that was primarily most of my education. So I think things like that, and I'm really glad conversations like that are starting and they are coming to the forefront. But I think things like that are also quite important to consider.
No, absolutely. And I think uh, diversifying, decolonizing the university syllabus is one small piece of the jigsaw puzzle, as it were. Uh, but whatever the school syllabus ends up doing, I think our job at university is to challenge thinking, right? It's to question, is to encourage, or certainly my job as a teacher, as an educator, is to encourage my students to question the obvious, to question the commonsensical, and not to question the commonsensical with any kind of certainty about an easy answer. There might not be an easy answer. There might not be an answer at all. But that doesn't mean we don't have to question everything. Um, that is not necessarily a transferable skill. That's not necessarily an employable skill. But it's absolutely certainly a life skill. And if my students leave my class with that skill, then I feel like I've done my job, right? Where my after my interaction with my students, if they can go out into the world, as it were, and are brave enough and strong enough to ask why. Why is it this way? How did we come to this point? Why do we believe this is true? Um, and what are the power structures that determine whose voice gets heard? And that involves a lot of self-reflection, self-introspection, both on my part and my students' part. So to just give one very quick example, one of the things I've become increasingly uncomfortable with, and quite honestly, I should have been much more uncomfortable with much earlier, is the way in which, we've used the term BAME quite a bit. We've also used the term people of color quite a bit, and the way in which, speaking myself personally, the way in which my South Asian identity is being used as an alibi to hide the almost complete absence of black faces and black bodies in our university is something that should have made me much more uncomfortable 5 years ago. And it has taken me longer than it should to have arrived at the point where, as we are talking about decolonizing the curriculum, as we are talking about increasing diversity, we have to bear in mind that not all diversity is equal. And within the category of person of color, BIPOC, BAME, whatever a term we decide fits best, and these terms are important. I'm not saying that we don't need them, but we need to recognize that not all people who fit those categories, those terms, are treated equally. And if we are serious about decolonizing our university space, we have to recognize the extent, not just the extent to which we are marginalized, but within our marginalization, the extent to which we are privileged, and how can we use that privilege.
No, definitely. And I think that's a conversation that's come up a lot, even while creation of the BAME network, because we did feel, obviously, while we felt like it was the best term to use as of
Yeah.
then, it also has its limitations. And there was that concept of emphasizing on only certain kinds of minorities, or also completely essentializing this experience of all minorities.
Yeah.
And it is a conversation that's being had even on, like, even amongst us as students. So yeah, it's definitely very important to consider and keep in mind.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Just generally, I think since we are living in such a strange time,
Yeah,
I wanted to obviously ask a question about the current situation with the
sure.
COVID-19 pandemic. So what kind of changes do you think will take place in teaching practices, and how do you think that's going to impact your interaction with students and just generally, like, exchange of knowledge and even conversations, because everything seems to have changed drastically?
It has. I, speaking personally, I am deeply uncomfortable with the way in which it seems we are hurtling back towards a kind of normality. Um, I'm uncomfortable with that because I think uh, we if we get too complacent about the trajectory of the pandemic, that's going to be a real problem. Um, I think both in terms of, there's a huge amount of research suggesting that people of color are disproportionately affected and at risk by from the virus. Um, St. Andrews specifically is in terms of its local town population, it's an older population. I am deeply concerned about the possible effects of bringing staff and students from all over the world into a small town, and the effect of on the local population that any local transmission might have as a result of this. Um, I think that if we are going to be serious about diversifying and decolonizing, it can't take place outside of an element um, of material analysis of the university system above and beyond any particular university. So we need to think about the issues raised by the marketization of universities, uh, the issues raised by increasing tuition fees, increasing living expenses, accommodation fees, and at what point do we come out and talk about what seems to me an obscenity within the university and within society generally, which is where we end up measuring human lives in terms of pounds and pence, right? Like that seems to me to be a fundamental obscenity. And if we are going to be serious, as I said earlier, about questioning the obvious and questioning the commonsensical, then we have to include the ways in which we function as an institution, right? Why is it that, in spite of what seems to me the obvious risks to posed by the pandemic, these risks have been pointed out by the staff trade unions. These risks have been pointed out by governments. They've been pointed out by the World Health Organization. They've been pointed out by SAGE, which is the independent scientific advisors to the government in Britain. In spite of all this advice, it is generally being taken as a default starting position that we have to have face-to-face teaching wherever possible. Um, Whatever the motivations of the individuals who are making these decisions are, may or may not be, and I'm not commenting on them because that's not something I know anything about. But one can't, in effect, one can't separate out the marketization of the university and the importance of education as a business, as opposed to education as a utility, from this decision-making process. I am in the very fortunate position of not having to teach next semester. Many of my colleagues aren't in that position. And there is a lot of anxiety. There is a lot of understandable anxiety among staff and students as to what the effects of face-to-face in-person teaching will be next semester. We hope these anxieties are misplaced and everything goes smoothly. But it seems to me that in because the focus has been on replicating in-person teaching as much as possible, wherever possible, we are missing out on fully exploring some of the opportunities that virtual teaching might have, not least in terms of decolonizing and diversifying, because suddenly it is much more possible to have a visiting guest lecture from an academic working in Rwanda, or from an academic uh, from South Pacific Islands, or the technology it doesn't level the playing field by any means. There's huge amounts of hierarchies in terms of who's allowed technology and who isn't. But if you are in a corner of Northeast Fife and you are genuinely interested in exposing your staff and students to knowledge from across the globe, then it seems that this was a perfect opportunity to really think properly, rigorously think about how we could do things differently. And I don't sense we are using that opportunity as well as we could have.
No, definitely. I completely agree because also about the anxieties of actually going back and the university encouraging students to come back. Obviously, it's been a very difficult decision to make. And in general, also concern about the population at St. Andrews because from what I've heard, people are back and it seems like things are becoming normal even around town. So let's hope that people do realize that precautions still need to be taken, and it's not normal in a
It's
sense.
not normal. I think we
Yeah,
have to remember that whatever happens next semester, we're not in the normality we knew before this pandemic.
yeah, and I think to a certain extent that perception of normalcy also comes from a position of privilege
Absolutely.
because you feel like you're not directly affected by it, whether it's you feel like you're young and it's fine, you can travel just because the government is saying it's okay. But it does come from an inherent sense of privilege. And I think all of us, like me included, need to understand that and not put others at risk as well as our own selves.
And I mean, this is something that will be familiar to you, I think. I was born in Britain. I moved to India when I was a little boy, and then moved back as a slightly older person. I've now lived in Britain since moving back for more than 20 years. This is the first time in 20 years that I've ever faced a situation where pretty much no matter what happens, I can't go and see my family. Now, that is the kind of pressure that no one who doesn't live away from family can understand. And this comes back to sort of the input of lived experience, right? Where you absolutely correctly spoke about the privilege that exists in being able to assume that things are normal. Well, that you can only have that privilege if you don't have a family halfway across the world, where you go, just because there's a pandemic doesn't mean other things stop. If someone in the family is really ill with COVID or not, if there's an emergency of any kind, I can't go. I can't be with my family. And there isn't enough explicit recognition of how that specific point affects staff and students, and disproportionately affects staff and students depending on where you're from.
Definitely. And I hope that these conversations also take more of a center stage now, and people actually realize that this is an issue. But thank you so much for speaking with me. And if there's any last thing you'd like to say or
No,
anything else
my
you want to share
absolute
with us.
pleasure. Thank you so much for asking me. Thanks for doing all this work. I hope this results in further fruitful staff-student conversations. And yeah, I look forward to being a part of those conversations.